The patrol had been moving through the Burmese jungle for 3 hours when Private Takeshi Yamamoto heard it. Not the usual sounds. Something else. A whisper of movement that made the hair on his neck stand up. He froze, rifle raised, peering into the darkness between the trees. 20 meters ahead, the trail curved around a massive teak trunk. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy. Then he saw them. Small men. Smaller than him, and Yamamoto stood only 5'4". They moved like shadows, making no sound despite the undergrowth. Wide-brimmed hats, something curved at their hips, catching a sliver of moonlight. Yamamoto opened his mouth to shout a warning. He never got the chance. The lead figure covered the distance in seconds. Yamamoto saw the blade come up, saw the curve of it, saw his own death in that arc of steel. The Kukri caught him across the throat before he could fire. Behind him, his squad mates died just as quickly, just as silently. The entire patrol eliminated in less than a minute. The small men melted back into the jungle, leaving only bodies and the thick smell of blood mixing with the earth. 3 kilometers away, at the Japanese company headquarters, Captain Hideaki Tanaka would spend the next morning trying to understand what had happened to Yamamoto's patrol. He would find them at dawn, arranged in a line, their throats cut with surgical precision. And he would see, carved into the bark of a tree above them, a symbol he didn't yet understand. A curved knife. A warning. This was February 1944. The Burma campaign had been grinding on for nearly 2 years, and Captain Tanaka thought he'd seen everything the British and Indians could throw at them. He was about to learn he was wrong. The Gurkhas had arrived. The story of what Japanese soldiers said when they encountered the Gurkhas in Burma is not a simple tale of one reaction or one moment. It's a progression, a growing understanding, and ultimately a fear that spread through the Japanese ranks like a disease. To understand it, you have to understand what the Japanese were expecting and what they got instead. When Japan invaded Burma in January 1942, their soldiers were riding high on a wave of victories. Malaya had fallen. Singapore had fallen. The British Empire was in retreat, and Japanese forces were pushing west with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. Their soldiers had been taught that Western troops were soft, that colonial forces would crumble, that Asian soldiers fighting for white masters had no real fighting spirit. The initial conquest of Burma seemed to confirm this. British and Commonwealth forces retreated north through the jungle and mountains, falling back toward India. It was the longest retreat in British military history, covering nearly 1,000 miles. Japanese soldiers wrote home about their victories, about the weakness of their enemies, about the coming triumph. But among those retreating forces were regiments that didn't fit the Japanese assumptions. Nepali soldiers from the mountain kingdom of Nepal, serving in the British Indian Army under their traditional name, Gurkhas. They'd been fighting for the British for over 100 years, and they had a reputation that predated this war by decades. The Japanese, focused on their rapid advance, didn't pay much attention at first. That was their first mistake. The Gurkhas came from the hills and mountains of Nepal, a landlocked kingdom in the Himalayas. They were hill men, born to altitude and steep terrain, raised in a warrior culture that went back centuries. British officers had been recruiting them since 1815, after fighting against them and being impressed by their ferocity. By World War II, Gurkha regiments were an established part of the British Indian Army, with their own traditions, their own identity, and their own weapon. The Kukri. Every Gurkha carried one. It was part of their uniform, part of their identity, part of their soul. The blade curved forward, heavy at the end, designed to chop with devastating effect. 18 inches long in most cases, though some were smaller, some larger. The curve meant that when you swung it, all the force concentrated at the point of impact. It could take off a head with one blow. It could split a skull. It could, in the hands of someone who'd trained with it since childhood, do things that made men who saw it never forget. Japanese soldiers had swords. The samurai tradition, the katana, the idea of the blade as the soul of the warrior. They understood intellectually the concept of a signature weapon. But the kukri was different. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't symbolic. It was a tool for killing, plain and simple, and the men who carried it used it with a casualness that was somehow more terrifying than any ritual. The first real encounters came during the retreat in 1942. Japanese forces were pursuing hard, trying to cut off and destroy the retreating Allied columns. In the chaos of that withdrawal, small actions erupted constantly. Rear guard fights, ambushes, desperate holding actions at river crossings and mountain passes. In one of these, a Japanese platoon cornered what they thought was a small group of Indian soldiers near a village in the Irrawaddy Valley. They moved in to finish them off. The Indians turned out to be a section of the 3rd Gurkha Rifles, cut off from their battalion and making their way north. What happened next was documented by a Japanese lieutenant who survived it, his account found in captured documents after the war. He described the Gurkhas as small men who fought like demons. He wrote that they didn't retreat when the Japanese attacked. They charged. Straight into the Japanese line, Kukri drawn, shouting what he described as terrifying war cries. The Japanese had numbers, had position, had every advantage, but the Gurkhas closed the distance before the Japanese could bring their superior firepower to bear, and once they were in close, the Kukris went to work. The lieutenant wrote that he'd never seen men die so quickly. The Gurkhas moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. They were smaller than the Japanese soldiers, but they were stronger than they looked, mountain-hardened, and they knew exactly where to cut. The lieutenant lost half his platoon in less than 5 minutes before the Gurkhas broke contact and disappeared into the jungle. He wrote that he'd never been so relieved to see an enemy withdraw. He wrote that he'd never want to face them again. He wasn't the only one. As the Burma campaign evolved from Japanese conquest to Allied defense and then to Allied counterattack, the Gurkhas became more than just another unit the Japanese faced. They became something the Japanese talked about, worried about, tried to avoid. This wasn't immediate. It built over time, through repeated encounters, through stories spreading through the ranks, through the accumulated weight of experience. By 1943, when the fighting had stabilized along the India-Burma border and both sides were preparing for the next phase, Japanese intelligence officers were compiling reports on Allied units. The Gurkhas featured prominently. One report, translated after the war, described them as the most dangerous of the enemy hill troops, and noted that they show particular aptitude for night operations and close combat. It recommended that Japanese units avoid close quarters engagement when possible, and maintain maximum distance when engaging Gurkha forces. This was remarkable. The Japanese military of World War II was not known for recommending that its soldiers avoid close combat. The entire ethos of Japanese infantry tactics emphasized aggressive spirit, the bayonet charge, the willingness to close with the enemy. But against the Gurkhas, their own officers were telling them to keep their distance. Why? The answer lies in what happened when they didn't. In the Arakan, the coastal region of Burma, where some of the fiercest fighting of the war took place, Gurkha units were heavily involved in a series of battles in 1943 and 1944. The terrain was nightmarish. Dense jungle, steep hills, monsoon rains that turned everything to mud. Perfect, in other words, for the kind of warfare the Gurkhas had trained for their entire lives. Japanese soldiers began reporting encounters that followed a pattern. The Gurkhas would attack at night, moving silently through the jungle, getting close before the Japanese even knew they were there. Then the Kukris would come out. Japanese sentries would be found dead at their posts, throats cut, heads nearly severed. Entire squads would be wiped out in their foxholes before they could raise an alarm. One Japanese sergeant, captured after a battle near Buthidaung, told his interrogators about a night attack that had hit his company. He said the first he knew of it was when the man in the foxhole next to him stopped responding to whispered questions. He'd crawled over to check and found his comrade dead, blood still flowing from a massive wound across his neck. He'd looked up to see a small figure standing over him, kukri in hand. He'd frozen, certain he was about to die. The Gurkha had looked at him for a long moment, then moved on to the next foxhole. The sergeant had played dead, listening to the sounds of his company being systematically slaughtered around him. He'd surrendered at first light, one of only 3 survivors from a company of over 100 men. His interrogators asked him why he thought the Gurkha had spared him. He said he didn't know. He said maybe the Gurkha had decided he was already dead. He said maybe the Gurkha had simply been in a hurry. He said he'd been having nightmares about it every night since, dreaming about that moment when he'd looked up and seen the blade. Stories like this spread. Soldiers talk, especially about the things that frighten them. The Gurkhas became a topic of conversation in Japanese units throughout Burma. They acquired nicknames. The little men with the big knives, the hill devils, the silent killers. Some Japanese soldiers began carrying the names as a kind of talisman, a warning. If you heard that Gurkhas were in the area, you doubled your sentries. You didn't go out on patrol at night if you could avoid it. You slept lightly. The psychological impact was significant. War is as much about morale as it is about bullets and bombs, and the Gurkhas were winning the psychological war in a way that went beyond simple combat effectiveness. They were in Japanese soldiers' heads. Part of it was the kukri itself. The weapon had a psychological weight that went beyond its physical capabilities. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with Gurkhas would describe the kukri in their letters and diaries, often with a kind of horrified fascination. The curve of it, the weight of it, the way it looked when it caught the light, the way it sounded when it hit flesh, the wounds it left. A Japanese medical officer, writing in his diary after treating casualties from a clash with Gurkhas, noted that the wounds were unlike anything else he'd seen. Clean, deep cuts, often to the neck and head, delivered with tremendous force. He wrote that several of the wounded had died despite his best efforts because the kukri had severed major blood vessels with such precision that there was nothing he could do. He wrote that the weapon seemed designed specifically to kill, with no wasted effort, no unnecessary damage. Just death. But it wasn't just the weapon. It was the men who wielded it. The Gurkhas had a reputation for being cheerful, friendly, even jovial when they weren't fighting. British officers who served with them often commented on their good humor, their loyalty, their willingness to share a joke or a song. But when combat started, something changed. They became focused, professional, utterly ruthless. There was no anger, no rage, no loss of control. Just efficient, methodical killing. This combination, cheerfulness off the battlefield and cold efficiency on it, was deeply unsettling to the Japanese soldiers who encountered it. They were used to enemies who showed fear or hatred or desperation. The Gurkhas showed none of these things. They just did their job, and their job was killing, and they were very good at it. The Battle of Imphal and Kohima in 1944 brought all of this to a head. This was Japan's last major offensive in Burma, an attempt to break through into India and cut the Allied supply lines. It was also one of the most brutal battles of the entire war, with fighting that lasted from March to July and casualties on both sides that numbered in the tens of thousands. Gurkha regiments were heavily involved in the defense. The 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 7th, and 10th Gurkha rifles all saw action during the battle. They fought on the hills around Imphal, in the streets of Kohima, in the jungle approaches where Japanese forces tried repeatedly to break through. Japanese soldiers who fought in this battle left accounts that show the evolution of their understanding of what they were facing. Early in the battle, there was still some of the old confidence, the belief that Japanese spirit and determination would carry the day. But as the weeks wore on and the casualties mounted, that confidence eroded. A Japanese officer, writing in his diary in April, described a night attack by Gurkhas on his battalion's position. He wrote that they came in complete silence, no war cries, no shouting, just the sound of movement in the darkness. He wrote that his men opened fire, but the Gurkhas kept coming, using the terrain, using cover, closing the distance. When they reached the Japanese trenches, the Kukris came out. The officer wrote that the fighting was savage beyond description and that his men were terrified of the curved knives. He lost a third of his battalion that night. The Gurkhas withdrew before dawn, taking their own casualties with them, leaving the Japanese to count their dead. By May, the same officer was writing in a very different tone. He described his men as exhausted and demoralized. He wrote that they were more afraid of the Gurkhas than of dying. He noted that several soldiers had asked to be transferred to other sectors, anywhere but where they might face the hill men again. He wrote that he'd had to threaten punishment to keep his unit together. This wasn't universal. The Japanese army still had plenty of soldiers who fought with determination and courage throughout the battle. But the Gurkhas had created a psychological effect that went beyond their actual numbers. There were only a few thousand Gurkhas at Imphal Kohima, out of tens of thousands of Allied troops. But they had an impact disproportionate to their size. Part of this was tactical. The Gurkhas were particularly effective in the kind of close quarters, hill fighting that characterized much of the battle. They knew how to use terrain, how to move quietly, how to hit hard and withdraw before the enemy could respond. They were masters of the night attack, the ambush, the raid. These were exactly the kinds of tactics that worked in the hills and jungles of Burma, but part of it was also the reputation itself, feeding on itself, growing with each encounter. Japanese soldiers who'd heard the stories were primed to fear the Gurkhas even before they met them. When they did meet them, the reality often lived up to or exceeded the reputation, which reinforced the fear, which spread more stories, which increased the fear in other units. One particular incident from Kohima became famous or infamous, depending on which side you were on. A Japanese company had captured a hilltop position and was digging in, preparing to hold it against the inevitable counterattack. The counterattack came that night, led by a company of the 4th Gurkha Rifles. The Japanese were ready, or thought they were. They had machine guns positioned, mortars registered, interlocking fields of fire. The Gurkhas attacked straight up the hill, into the teeth of the Japanese defenses. It should have been suicide, but they moved so fast, using every fold in the ground, every piece of cover, that the Japanese couldn't bring effective fire to bear. And when the Gurkhas reached the Japanese positions, they went through them like a scythe through wheat. The Kukris did most of the work. By the time the sun came up, the hilltop was back in Allied hands, and the Japanese company had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. A Japanese lieutenant who escaped the massacre told his superiors that the Gurkhas had been like ghosts, like demons. He said his men had fought hard, but you cannot fight ghosts with bullets. He said the Kukris had been everywhere, rising and falling, and men had died so fast that there hadn't been time to understand what was happening. He said he'd run, which was a shameful admission for a Japanese officer, but he'd run because staying meant dying, and dying to ghosts seemed pointless. His report was filed away, but the story spread. The Gurkhas who attacked up that hill, who took that position against prepared defenses, who killed a company of Japanese soldiers in close combat, they became part of the legend. What did Japanese soldiers actually say when they saw Gurkhas? The answer varied, but certain phrases appear again and again in captured documents, diaries, and post-war accounts. Oiga kita, the small ones have come. Katana no oni, sword demons. Though Kukri doesn't translate directly, and the Japanese often used their own word for sword to describe the weapon. Yoru no akuma, Night devils. These weren't official designations. They were soldier slang, the kind of names troops give to things they fear, and they spread because the fear spread. Not every Japanese soldier feared the Gurkhas. Some fought them with courage and determination. Some killed Gurkhas in combat because the Gurkhas, for all their skill and ferocity, were still human and still vulnerable to bullets and shells and all the other instruments of modern war. The Gurkhas took casualties throughout the Burma campaign, sometimes heavy casualties. They weren't invincible, but they were effective, and they were frightening. And those two things together created a psychological advantage that the Allies exploited. British commanders, aware of the Gurkhas' reputation, would sometimes use them in situations specifically designed to maximize psychological impact. Night raids, ambushes, attacks on positions where Japanese morale was already shaky. The presence of Gurkhas in a sector became a tool of psychological warfare, whether intentionally or not. Japanese commanders tried to counter this. They issued orders telling their men that the Gurkhas were just soldiers like any other, that they could be killed like anyone else, that fear was the enemy. They tried to spread their own stories, accounts of Japanese victories over Gurkhas, examples of Gurkha prisoners taken or Gurkha attacks repulsed. It didn't really work. The stories of Japanese defeats at Gurkha hands were more numerous, more vivid, more memorable. And they kept coming because the Gurkhas kept fighting all through 1944 and into 1945 as the Allied reconquest of Burma gained momentum. By the final phase of the campaign, when Allied forces were pushing south toward Rangoon and Japanese forces were in retreat, the pattern had been established. Japanese units would fight hard against most Allied forces, but when they identified Gurkhas in the opposing force, their resistance often weakened. Not always, not universally, but enough to be noticeable, enough to be documented, enough to matter. A British intelligence report from March 1945 noted that Japanese prisoners, when interrogated, would often ask if Gurkhas had been involved in the battle where they were captured. If told yes, they would nod, as if that explained their defeat. If told no, they seemed almost relieved, as if being captured by non-Gurkha forces was somehow less shameful. This wasn't about Japanese soldiers being cowards. The Japanese army fought with tremendous courage throughout the war, often to the point of self-destruction. Japanese soldiers would charge machine gun nests, would fight to the last man, would choose death over surrender in situations where surrender was the rational choice. They weren't afraid of dying, but they were afraid of how they might die. And the Kukri represented a particular kind of death, personal and brutal, that struck at something deep in the human psyche. It wasn't the impersonal death of an artillery shell or a bullet from 100 meters away. It was intimate. It was someone close, enough to touch you, close enough to look you in the eye, close enough to smell, choosing to end your life with a blade. That kind of death is harder to face than the abstract possibility of being killed by distant fire. The Gurkhas understood this, even if they didn't articulate it in those terms. They understood that the Kukri was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. Some Gurkha units would sharpen their Kukris where Japanese soldiers could see them doing it. Some would leave Kukris behind at ambush sites, stuck into trees or the ground, a calling card and a warning. Some would make sure that Japanese soldiers saw the Kukri before they saw anything else, drawing it deliberately, letting the moonlight catch the blade, letting the fear build for just a moment before the attack came. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was warfare. The more afraid the enemy was, the less effectively they fought. The less effectively they fought, the fewer casualties your own side took. It was pragmatic, professional, and utterly ruthless. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the Gurkhas had established a reputation in Burma that would last for decades. Japanese veterans who wrote about their experiences would almost always mention the Gurkhas, usually with a kind of grudging respect, mixed with remembered fear. They would describe them as formidable warriors, as the most dangerous enemy we faced in the jungle, as small men with big hearts and sharp knives. The Gurkhas themselves were more modest. When asked about their reputation, they would typically shrug it off. They'd been doing their duty, they'd say. They had been fighting for their regiments, for their comrades, for their honor. The Kukri was just a tool. The fighting was just a job. Nothing special, but the Japanese soldiers who'd faced them knew differently. They knew that the Gurkhas were something special, something different, something that had gotten into their heads and stayed there. Years after the war, Japanese veterans would still sometimes wake up from nightmares about small men with curved knives, moving silently through the jungle, coming closer in the darkness. The statistics tell part of the story. Gurkha regiments in Burma suffered approximately 10,000 casualties during the campaign, killed and wounded. They inflicted casualties many times that number on Japanese forces. They fought in every major battle from the initial invasion in 42 to the final liberation in 45. They earned numerous decorations for valor, including multiple Victoria Crosses, the highest award for bravery in the British military. But statistics don't capture the psychological dimension, the fear factor, the way the mere presence of Gurkhas in a sector could affect Japanese morale and decision-making. That's harder to quantify, but it was real, and it mattered. The relationship between Japanese soldiers and Gurkhas in Burma was complex. It was enemy and enemy, certainly. But it was also a kind of mutual recognition. The Japanese respected martial prowess, respected the warrior tradition, respected courage and skill in combat. The Gurkhas embodied all of these things, so even as Japanese soldiers feared them, they also, in a strange way, respected them. Some Japanese accounts describe watching Gurkhas from a distance, observing how they moved, how they carried themselves, how they prepared for battle. There's an almost anthropological quality to some of these observations, as if the Japanese were trying to understand what made these men so effective, so dangerous, so different from other Allied soldiers. The answer, of course, was complicated. It was culture, tradition, training, terrain, tactics, psychology, and a dozen other factors all working together. The Gurkhas were products of their mountain homeland, shaped by centuries of warrior tradition, honed by British military training, and tempered in the crucible of jungle warfare. They were, in short, exactly the right soldiers in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And the Japanese, for all their own martial tradition, for all their own courage and determination, found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't quite figure out how to beat. They could kill Gurkhas, yes? They could win individual battles against them, but they couldn't break them, couldn't demoralize them, couldn't make them stop coming. And in the end, that was what mattered. When Japanese soldiers saw Gurkhas in Burma, what they said depended on the moment, the circumstances, the individual. Some said nothing, too focused on fighting or too dead to speak. Some shouted warnings to their comrades. Some whispered prayers, some cursed, some simply stared, trying to process what they were seeing, trying to understand how men so small could be so dangerous. But underneath all the different reactions, all the different words, there was a common thread: recognition, fear, respect, the understanding that they were facing something extraordinary, something that would stay with them long after the battles ended, long after the war was over, long after they went home to try to rebuild their lives. The Gurkhas had come to Burma, and the Japanese would never forget it.